You cannot complain about your country's state of development if you don't join in, if you don't participate. You cannot be a commentator. You need to be an actor.
Hello, everyone. My name is Judy Sikuza, host of the Mandela Rhodes Foundation podcast. In this episode, we are joined by Mark-Alexandre Doumba, Minister of Digital Economy, Digitization and Innovation in Gabon. Mark-Alexandre is part of a new generation of African leaders working at the intersection of public policy, entrepreneurship, and technology. He's also recognized globally as a member of the World Economic Forum's Young Global Leaders Community, an acknowledgement of leaders shaping the future across sectors and regions. From founding a digital finance company, expanding financial inclusion, to now shaping national digital strategy, his work sits at the heart of how African navigates the opportunities and the risks in a digital age. Mark-Alexandre, it's a pleasure to have you with us. How are you coming into the space today?
I'm doing good. Thank you so much, Judy. I'm very happy to be here joining this conversation. I'm feeling good.
Perfect. So before we delve into, the incredible professional journey you've had, it would be lovely for our listeners just to get a sense of your foundations. So we'd like to know who and what have been the biggest influences in your life and how have they shaped your outlook on leadership and service?
Well, I would tell you that two people have shaped my life. I would say it could sound cliche, but it's both my parents. My dad is from Gabon. He, was a banker, but then served in public service for, many years. And he's somebody who loves his country, loves his nations, has a deep passion for development, and with a very pragmatic approach, which is how can you touch somebody's life and make it better? How can you add value to the people around you? And he's also always placed a very heavy emphasis on education and skills, pushing us to pursue our studies. And as far as my mom didn't have as much as a stellar career as my dad on paper, but she's somebody who's been by my side day in, day out, supporting me, advising me, helping me through my many challenges growing up and as well through work. And I think that she's been a force that's been working behind the scenes, but that has been a very central reason why I've been able to, achieve some of the humble things I've been able to do to date.
That's very beautiful. I mean, and also quite a privilege, right? To have such a grounding home environment that really allows you to be able to form and become who you are. So within that context then, who was the young boy, Mark-Alexandre? If you look at the 10-year-old version of you, right? Like, what were some of the things that you enjoyed doing in terms of hobbies and interests? What sort of brought you joy then? And maybe now, thinking about yourself in the role that you're in, do you still find time to be able to do things that can help you switch off,
Yeah. So the 10-year-old version of Mark is somebody who is very into tennis, very into sports. At the age of 5, my mom, was like, okay, I need you to find an activity. So she put me at football, soccer. She made me play tennis table, basketball. And tennis is a sport that I picked up. And it was not just something that I did on the side. It became like a central part of my life. So if I was not at school, I was on a tennis court, hitting balls, practicing, hoping I would become the next Roger Federer. And tennis has definitely shaped my life. It did not work out, like Roger Federer did, but there's so much good things that have happened because I've played tennis and I'm somebody who always really enjoyed music. I actually liked to produce. Maybe at 10, I was not producing music, but around the age of 13, I, had a sort of piano where I started producing and making beats because I really liked hip hop and R&B in the early 2000s. So heavy influenced by the culture and by music.
I love it. Okay. Well, I was actually going to ask you about the tennis giants you grew up watching, you know, because I myself also had a potential Serena Williams dream, you know. I also played tennis, actually very competitively. Yeah. So in the 90s, you know, late 90s, early 2000s, we were watching those guys. So it was almost like you had the Pete Sampras, Andre Agassi guys, what was it, Martina Hingis, and then the Serena sisters, then they were sort of challenging, you know, the system. But yes, Roger Federer, because he is just such a gentleman and just a masterclass. So that's a good person to have tried to be.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
So the R&B stuff, so you're saying more 2000s. I mean, the good stuff is in the 90s though. You know what I mean? Like you oughta, you know, like the proper, or like Aliyah, you know, she had Brandy, you know. It's great to know that, you can sort of still tap into those parts. Because I think it's important to have that balance as leaders, to find things that also give us motivation. As you said, you know, the tennis, you didn't go all the way, but you got some valuable skills from that you feel teach you about discipline and perseverance and all of those good things, you know? So thanks for sharing that. All right. So I'd love us to go a little bit deeper now on your journey. So it spans finance, entrepreneurship, and now public leadership at the highest level. How did your early experiences across investment, venture capital, and building your own company shape the way that you think about leadership today?
I think starting my career in investment banking in what we call mergers and acquisitions as a financial analyst was very interesting because, you're 21, at least when I joined, and I had left the United States where I was studying to move to Dubai, the UAE. That was in 2008. So, at the time of the financial crisis, it was really interesting because as an analyst, you're working on big transactions, by, large corporates in the Middle East who are trying to make investments in Africa. So right out of school, you're just thrown into this world of investments, of acquisitions, of interacting with governments. But, from the banking and private sector perspective, and I think you learn a lot. You learn from the entrepreneurs who are either buying or selling their businesses. And as you're interacting with them, you learn about their journey, you learn about the challenges, you learn about the opportunities, and you see success in real time because, that's the type of people that you get surrounded with when you're in that investment world. But on the other side, you also work with governments because sometimes you're advising governments on, mobilizing financing to fund water projects, infrastructure projects, roads, ports. So you're also thrown into the development challenges that, policymakers face in trying to push development at a macro level. So it's a great place to be in investment banking at the intersection of private sector and public sector.
Brilliant. And so I'm quite curious, on that entrepreneurial side of your journey, right? You founding the digital finance company, focusing on expanding access to underserved populations. So was that something that came up for you based on the experiences that you had and what you're observing, and was it a sense of experiencing the inequality and not just like it being a social issue, but that actually it's a system design problem? How were you navigating that as a founder of a digital finance company?
Yeah. I mean, even before, explaining sort of how, when you're investment banking and then I moved over to what you call private equity, where you're deploying capital, you can still be a bit frustrated because you want to deploy capital, but it's not your own capital. So you don't have too much control over where, your capital is being allocated. So it's normal because you're young, you're learning. So it's part of your growth trajectory to first, do what other people are telling you to do before you can start doing what you want to do. And I think that the choice to move over to entrepreneurship at some point was to try to have a bit more control over how I can intervene and support Africa's development, but having my own creativity and space to think and decide on the way I can engage. I was lucky to make some investments to accumulate a bit of capital and to start making investment decisions and focus on building a fintech. So digital finance. I felt that, Africa is a place where you have 20%, 15 to 25% of the population with the banking account. It's the, home birth of mobile money that has done tremendously well. And I felt that mobile money works, but it works at scale because the telecom companies are providing a commodity to everyone. But then if you want to focus on specific problems or specific niches, multinationals are not the best at it. They're the best at addressing problems at scale, but they're not the best at addressing specific niche, development challenges. And this is what drove me to start, ClickPay at the time. As the only fintech in Central Africa to have a license from the central bank and to be able to push mobile financial services to banked people, but mostly to unbanked people so that they can be financially included and start paying government services and start having more access to finance.
Very interesting. So at the Mandela Rhodes Foundation, I'm just sort of reflecting now with what you're saying. We often think about leadership as a set of choices, especially when the consequences are not immediately visible. So in digital transformation, I'm imagining that many of the decisions that you make today may only really reveal their full impact years from now. So how do you approach decision making when the ethical consequences are long-term, complex, and not always predictable?
Yeah, this is such a good question, Judy. So I think the question you're asking me as a policymaker today, I can probably, grasp the depth of your question better than when I was an entrepreneur in the private sector, because an entrepreneur has to, look at, okay, I want to do this, but then, when will that generate income for me to be able to sustain my initiative? So we want to tackle long-term challenges, but we are constrained by our working capital and by our ability to mobilize the funding to address this issue. So oftentimes we make short-term decisions that sort of are just successive. So a 6-month decision and then another 6-month decision and then another 6-month decision. In policy, I would say that you have to think very, very long term. You cannot just design policies for the next 6 months. You have to think about long-term trends, mega trends, and think about how you can make policy making decisions that can make your country and your people better off over a very long term. And as far as the ethical challenges, you have to try in the best of your ability to think about, if you make a decision today, what will people say about it 5 to 10 years from now? If you're making a decision today and somebody finds out about it, will you be ashamed of it? Will you be able to defend the decision? Will you be comfortable with it? And, oftentimes, these are sort of the checkpoints that make you help determine the ethics of, making decisions, whether in the private sector or in the public sector. We live in a world that's so transparent now, where everything that you do ends up being known sooner or later. So you want to be in a position where you can, own your decisions and defend them if you're in a position where you have to do so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's a very real leadership responsibility in a sense, right? Because then it means your decisions must be values-based, because only from that place can you defend it, right? It's saying this was the value in the Constitution we were trying to achieve. We consulted the relevant people. We had to find compromises, and to the best of our ability, this is what we are proposing, for the population. I really like that. And then I guess I'm curious because, in a sense, Gabon with, it's only a few years really with the constitution really being formed in the way that it has been, a very intentional approach, for the whole sort of nation to innovate, to think about the future, to bring in young people into sort of positions like you are as a minister. But I think oftentimes young people sitting maybe in the position you were in at 21, who have the potential to want to be contributing at a policy level, feel resistant, particularly in the African continent, of putting their hands up there, because perhaps there might be this sentiment that the old guard is not going to allow for voices of young people. Now you're coming here with your fancy degrees and, AI talk and, what are you talking about? So how have you navigated that transition as someone who came from corporate to running your own shop and then transitioning to understanding the systemic realities of working at that level?
Well, I think that you've described so many challenges that I'm facing, whether, upon my return, when I moved from Dubai into Gabon, first 5 years ago in 2020, that's when I decided to start building businesses because I felt that you cannot complain about your country's state of development if you don't join in, if you don't participate. You cannot be a commentator. You need to be an actor. So I decided to move and to build 3 enterprises. The first one was a business registration portal. So the idea is that entrepreneurship drives development and drives growth. So we designed the first public-private partnership with the government to digitize business registrations. Over the past 5-6 years in Gabon, we've got over 60,000 businesses that have left the informal economy to the formal economy, thanks to the digitization of the whole business registration process. And it's that entity and that work that led me to digital finance, because I thought, well, if you have 60,000 businesses that are now in the formal economy, they need financial tools to be able to collect payments, issue payments, pay salaries. And that's how we were able to vertically integrate into digital finance. And the third entity is in healthcare. We built what was first a diagnostic center that then became a private hospital where we have treated over the past 4 years now 120,000 people. So these are initiatives as an entrepreneur that I did before I joined government. So already as an entrepreneur, I felt that it was very difficult to interact with the government. Governments are risk averse. They tend to prefer to bet on foreign companies and on local entrepreneurs and local companies. They work on a sort of group think type of way where everybody thinks the same way and there's not so much space for innovation and for trying something different. So I was facing these barriers. And then as I entered the public sector, I'm realizing or learning as well that if you've not gone through the ranks as a normal person and you're just a young person who went from private sector ownership to becoming Minister of Finance before I then became Minister of Digital Economy, well, there's just a whole lot of people who are frustrated because they feel that you didn't earn your stripes the same way that they might have. So that's one point of resistance. The second point of resistance is being a private sector person in the public sector environment with a mentality with regards to the way you process and make decisions, to the speed at which you're trying to move, to your language and the way you sort of think about development, the way you challenge traditional conventions. It can make some people feel uneasy. So I think one of the real important tools that you need to have if you're a young person, who's trained, skilled, who's learned in various capacity and you're trying to exercise leadership at the public level is to have humility, right? Is all of those stripes that you've earned throughout your life, you know that you have them, but don't go out there and expose them to people and say, I went to X school and I've worked in this place and, I know better than you, because this is what will get you shut down by the establishment.
Yeah, 100%. I really like that humility. It's a very important provocation. All right, so let's zone out a little bit and maybe go to sort of the global landscape. You, of course, are part of the World Economic Forum's Young Global Leaders Network, a space that brings together leaders who are grappling with global risk, technology disruption, and governance challenges. So how has that global exposure shaped the way that you think about ethical leadership, particularly in ensuring that Africa is not just included in digital global system conversations, but is actively shaping them?
So as a minister, I tend to believe that as an African minister, we need to be participating and engaging in those global governance conversations a lot more than we have in the past. I have some people in my government who might feel that I am too much out there trying to be part of this conversation and shaping the narrative. But I'm trying to explain to them that the digital economy is a new economy. And the old economy, which, is the real economy, Africa has been marginal or operating on the margins. for a reason is that when those rules were shaped after World War II, we were not at the table. So the rules were shaped, whether it's, the UN, the World Bank, the IMF, then the Bretton Woods institutions. All these rules were designed and we were not at the table. And these rules and this governance framework has shaped the incentives and the dynamics for the past 60 years. So we represent 3% of global trade, 3% of global FDI is captured by the continent. And that's not because we don't want to increase our share in the global economy. It's because the rules and the governance is designed in a way that assigns very little value to natural resources, and we've been unable to move up the value chain. So how can we now make sure that as we enter the digital economy, this new economy, we can be actively shaping this new governance system so that, our stakes is taken into consideration in the way incentives are structured, in the way value is going to be created, and in the way value can be retained more on the continent so that we can have more employment and so that we can, generate growth and the development that our population aspire to. So we need to be at the table. We need to be sharing our agenda. We need to be expressing our needs when it comes to sovereignty. We need to stop exporting raw resources, whether it's talent, natural resources, ideas and whatnot. We need to beneficiate it more locally, and we need to get our values worth in the global economy. These are values that I very much, believe in if we want to change the narrative in a way that's more favorable to the 2.5 billion Africans that will be, living on this earth by 2050.
Yeah, no, I really like that, and very much in support of us being at the table. I guess part of my devil's advocate to us, though, because in a sense, you're starting to speak about numbers, 2050, etc. We know that by 2030, 70% of the continent is under the age of 35. So in a sense, in 10 years' time, you and me are going to be elders at this rate because,
Yeah.
And so in a sense, this is now our generation's time to really be intentional in thinking about what that agenda looks like. So my devil's advocate question, and I'm saying it to us, as this generation is,
of course,
as Africans, are we getting together enough to make sure that when we go to these global platforms, we are speaking with one voice? Because sometimes this is my struggle as someone who's also part of similar, forums like you, is that you go to Davos, the EU says, this is what the EU bloc's intentionality is for the next XYZ, right? Clear. They've had conversations, they've talked. What is your sense and observations about the extent to which we as Africans are having enough conversations ourselves to be clear on that vision as we then go to these global platforms and put the positions forward?
No, I think your point is so important. Firstly, what you're doing, convening me to these conversations and other people to have this conversation is very important. It's already part of convening some of us to have, important conversations about the state of our continent. I'm from Gabon, you're from South Africa, and we're, exchanging values and expressing aspirations that should bind us. I think that we still unfortunately operate as 54 different countries. Despite the fact that we have the African Union is weakened by the fact that the contributors are more Western countries and even our own countries. We don't contribute to, our share of the financing and the running of the AU's operations. And therefore, who pays comments, right? So that's something that we need to first do is we need to make sure that when we have regional organizations, we contribute fairly to give them the strength to be able to go out there and to speak with a voice that's autonomous and that's independent from the funding that comes, with strings attached from those who contribute to, the sustaining of our operations. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that, we've talked about the African, free trade agreement for a long time, and it's an amazing ambition, but we've just not been operating it, for a long time. And I think sometimes, when you cannot find a reason to explain something, you need to ask why 3 times. Why are, regional trade agreements or regional cooperation not working? And I think if you ask me why 3 times, maybe we might get to the reasons why that's really happening. But I think our countries still compete with each other. I think each country wants to be better than the other one. I think each country is still operating on maybe, pre-liberation mindsets where, we are trying to build autonomous relationships with foreign partners that are not as optimal as they would be if we were working together as a bloc to engage with the rest of the world. You can see the European Union, who have had, 2 world wars where they fought and killed each other. They still managed at some point to create the European Union, to have a common currency and to have a single market. The United States, were separate states, but they still found a way to federalize their, government in order to work more actively. Asia has trading blocs that are working well. They trade more within each other than they trade with the rest of the world. We are probably the only continent that trades more with the rest of the world than we trade with each other. I think obviously there are historical reasons for that, but we cannot, speak to history forever. We need to be changing that in our generation with the affiliations that we have, with the mindset that we have, with the skill sets that we've accumulated, and with the benefit of hindsight. We need to do better.
Yeah. I mean, you probably have more recent stats on this, but I do sort of have that sense of, intra-African trade being really only about 15 to 20%, of trade. And that is to what you just said now, Europe, 60 to 70% in intracontinental trade, Asia, 50%, right? So it's almost like part of what you were alluding to from your comment about the AU and who funds it and how we think about our own investment into ourselves. But then this dynamic of limited industrial capacity, infrastructural challenges. And I've been imagining the struggle that African governments might have is knowing that you need to deal with domestic issues and making sure that, people are fed, people have healthcare, people go to have education. But then there's the economic component that influences everything and one's ability to be able to progress, right? So I guess I also sit with this dilemma about how people understand the role of government in providing an environment for prosperity. Because in a sense, in South Africa at least, you hear people say, the government is not creating enough jobs. And then I'm like, but that's not your job description of government unless I've misunderstood it. My understanding is it's to create the environment, right? The policy environment that allows for entrepreneurs to come up, small business to come up, et cetera, et cetera. So what in your view then is sort of the challenges that maybe African governments sit with around that expectation that citizens, for some reason, and I'm saying this not in a general sense, Mandela Rhodes Scholars come from 38 African countries. Year on year, I hear similar stories of people being frustrated that the government's not creating jobs, So what do you think are the sort of stumbling blocks in citizens really understanding what the role of government is, and then also what opportunities exist to shift that narrative so that you can have more agency even from the ground up?
Yeah. I mean, so I'll answer in 2 ways. Firstly, on your observation with the stats on, regional trade. So there are 3 reasons why I believe this is happening, why we don't trade much with each other, but why other regional blocs trade with each other. First one is that we produce the same things. So, if Cameroon and Gabon produce raw materials, we don't really have reasons to trade with each other because I'm trading tomatoes to you and you're selling tomatoes back to me. There's no reason to really trade with you. If you look at what we do with the rest of the world is we trade tomatoes to Europe and then we import ketchup, right? Because they have the industrial capacity to add value to our raw materials and then we import it back because we've not invested in the industrial, networks to produce ketchup. So one of the first things is the African countries that will industrialize first will be able to grow at a faster rate because they'll just import raw materials from the other countries and they'll sell back, added value products. The second reason is that it's cheaper to trade with the rest of the world through maritime routes than it is to trade with each other through road and train networks. Train networks are poorly integrated in Africa, and the road networks face also, very significant challenges. So when you look at the cost of a container, trading outwards is usually cheaper than it is within the continent. And the third thing is energy. So long as energy costs are as high as they are and as insufficient as it is, developing industry is tough. South Africa is a standalone, with Egypt to some extent and Morocco more and more, is you are some of the few African countries with an industrial base, where you convert natural resources into semi-finished and finished products. And obviously that's an amazing positioning to be in. With regards to governments or in the role of a minister, of a policymaker in creating jobs, you are right. I think that the role of a government is to create the policy environment that enables private sector investment. It's not the role of a government to create jobs. But if you create an enabling environment where entrepreneurship thrives, where local domestic investments is generated, where foreign direct investment is interested, you're going to have capital accumulation in industrial networks, in, services, companies that will create jobs. And the policy environment that we see in our countries is not that attractive yet. We tend to have, regulations that change, regularly, or that are the same, but the interpretation of that regulation changes according to who's in office, which is another challenge, and it creates discontinuity and uncertainty. I'm sure it looks like you've, been through, that, before. So there's too much interpersonal, relationship in environments that should not be so interpersonal, because business is about rules. It's not about who's in office, who's your friend, who you get along with. It should be the same regardless of who's in office. So that's where I think we really need to be stronger. And in the literature, it's called, informal institutions. Africa has too many informal institutions, or too much informal institutions, as opposed to formal institutions. Maybe the last thing that I can say on the role of government is that we are competing to attract private capital against the rest of the world. Somebody who's based in, Tokyo, has 193 countries to choose to invest in outside of Japan. And out of those 193 countries, if he chooses or she chooses to invest in Africa, well, then you have 54 countries to choose, between. And the environment that will provide the best, regulatory space is the country that will capture this investment. So we need to compete with each other by bringing the standards upwards so that the continent can mobilize capital at scale, so that they can be the jobs that will be provided, because this is a major challenge for all of us, government makers and business leaders and, NGO leaders as well.
No, I mean, I'm really resonating with that, because there is something that frustrates me about the thought of African governments and the lack of excellence, And the thing is, and this actually links nicely to our chat earlier about tennis, right? And sports in general. If you've played sports, you're in a team sport, is you say you the goalkeeper, you the striker, you the midfielder, and you want to make sure if you're working for this government or for this organization that people look at you and they're jealous that you are wearing that number 10 shirt. Why? Because you're consistent, you're reliable, you're excellent, you're always pushing the boundaries, So there's something about almost like perhaps as our generation, we're being invited to reimagine the organizational culture, structures of government, right? In terms of thinking about excellence as a standard that we can then compete with each other, But then I guess there's a tension, right? Because much of today's innovation is driven by speed, right? Build fast, scale quickly, iterate as you go. But governance seems to have a different rhythm. One that, is thinking obviously about accountability because people have been elected. You're thinking about inclusion. You're thinking about trust. You're thinking about service delivery. How do you navigate the tension between urgency to innovate and the responsibility to get it right for the people?
This is a real tension, which I'm facing. I mean, technology moves so quickly. I just actually, before this conversation, was at a meeting with the World Bank. And that was precisely the conversation that we're having, is that policymakers, we have a set time in office. And technology moves so quickly that the procurement process for World Bank financing is so slow that by the time you end up procuring the technology, the next version has already come out and you're always running after technology and after innovation. So, we were discussing how can we have governments make decisions more quickly? How can we have our development partners also reduce the time it takes to provide funding in order to do procurement more quickly in an environment where technology is just evolving, that rapidly? So, I think we do need to have organizational redesign, especially when it comes to the ministries of digital economy. That institution needs to be, to the extent that is possible, designed in a way that reflects the speed at which technology moves, at which innovation moves, and the fluidity of technology services. You can be in Gabon or in South Africa, but you're consuming products from companies that don't have an office in your country, right? When you look at the big tech, the Googles and the Amazons and the open AIs and so on, they don't have operations in our countries, but we're consuming their products and they are moving so quickly that we need to be able to regulate them to protect our population, but also to integrate their technologies in our production function. So you need to move fast, but you also need to regulate so that you don't get extracted in the new economy in the same way as we were in the real economy.
Well, then this brings this question of artificial intelligence, right? Because this rapidly moving technology you're speaking to, some people feel very scared when they hear about AI. It's going to take out jobs and, we're all going to be obsolete, etc. Are you then saying from the previous statement that there's this balance one has to manage at a government level around pushing for innovation and thinking about, especially in Africa, the unemployment, rate? I think, for you guys, it's about 20%. We're double at 40, and young people in South Africa, 50% of them are unemployed. So we're sitting with this tension where there's people who are educated and have grown up in a digital world and an AI world who are ready to go. And can government create the policy environments where those young people can be taken in? But then at the same time, you're saying there's a consciousness about how quickly things are moving and that there might need to be regulatory interventions to sort of balance things out. But then doesn't that affect the point from earlier about investments? Are people going to want to come and invest in a place that's not technologically moving as quickly,
No, you're absolutely right. When I was in the private sector, I used to believe that we need to push the adoption of technology as fast as possible. And by having, however, African-owned companies at the leading, the digital transformation in our countries. And then I moved to the public sector, and earlier this year, I published a piece called Premature Automation. And the idea is that African countries should not embrace AI, without guardrails. So we should not adopt AI layers without thinking deliberately about how it's going to affect our labor market or institutional readiness to, protect our users from it. My concern is that, firstly, we don't own much of the technology that we consume on the continent at present. Even if we talk about mobile money, it's an amazing infrastructure. It's done tremendously well connecting Africans to financial services and to the formal markets, but we don't own the infrastructure most of the times. And therefore, what's happening is you have foreign multinationals, managing and controlling our financial flows, and now the data that also transit through this infrastructure. And AI now comes as a new layer of technology that comes stack on top of the existing tech stack, which in my view is entrenching current dependencies for, decades to come. So we need to think about what are we doing about our current technology that we're consuming? Should we deliberately embrace as fast as we can new layers of technology, or should we sequence and make sure and find and regulate in a way that the new layers of technology can have more African ownership so that we are not too dependent on foreign firms? Especially now we're seeing that technology is becoming a geopolitical tool, a geostrategic tool, even, a military tool, right? So we cannot just embrace it without thinking about, back to your earlier questions on ethics. If you know that using and consuming foreign tech can create long-lasting dependencies on your population for decades to come, should you today embrace it, or should you, sequence and regulate it in a way that can protect the long-term interests of your nation? This is a real tension that I would share. And maybe last point on this is, you're right. Investors want to invest in environments where things are moving fast. So my point is not to say that we should not adopt technologies. I'm saying that we need to build the capacity to produce the technologies that we're consuming.
No, I like that. And so in this rapidly changing technological world, what do you think this moment is demanding of leaders that previous generations may not have needed to confront in the same way?
I mean, look, the threats, the instabilities are coming from everywhere at any time because we operate in an open environment. You can be in South Africa, can be in Gabon. We just wake up in the morning, you read the news, and then suddenly there was a military intervention in another country, on another continent. And then suddenly, the price of gas increases, trade routes are affected, and it creates inflation in your country that is imported. But that's not as a result of poor local macroeconomic policies. It's just as a result of externalities coming from, what we operate in, which is a globally interconnected world. So I think there's the, geopolitics that's affecting the way we operate in our countries as policymakers, as entrepreneurs, as leaders of non-government organizations, where we're currently and constantly dealing with external pressures that we need to manage. Then there's the fact that we have a generation that demands more of their leaders or people in position of authority, which is forcing many of us to rethink the way we support our nations, which force us to rethink what it means to be a person in a position of authority, and to have obviously more empathy, more care, and to do better than what's been out there. We are now exercising leadership in environments where your population knows what's happening in other countries. So you cannot, unlike previous generation, isolate your population and make them think that they have everything that they should be having. They can go on the internet. They can see that their neighboring country or another country elsewhere lives in much better condition. And this applies a lot of pressure on us to do better. You also have, obviously, and you mentioned it, the demographic dividend with, all these young people coming onto the job market every year. There are 12 million Africans coming on the job market every year, and you only have 3 million jobs that are being created. This is a significant challenge. How do we support them? How do we support issues of mental health that are, a consequence of the consumption of technologies? How do you deal with, the competing priorities that governments have now, which is that we need to, at the same time, solve development challenges from previous industrial revolutions, like, roads and energy and access to water. But at the same time, we need to be embracing and surfing on the current one, which is moving at a fast pace and which is rather complex because it rests on your ability to have the right human capital to, support your digital transformation and innovation-led growth. So many challenges at the same time. You have to be speaking many different languages, and you need to be able to understand, so many different challenges. And obviously, that means, again, being humble, that you are limited in your ability to address everything, but you need to surround yourself with people, and you need to engage and collaborate and be inclusive and support more people in a better way than we used to in the past.
Yeah, I love that. When you think about wisdom from the previous generation of African leadership, what should we make sure we don't lose as we move forward in addressing some of the challenges you spoke to?
There's a saying that I like. It's that, you don't know what you don't know, right? And each generation, stands on the shoulders of the previous generation. And each generation is accumulating knowledge and capabilities based on the knowledge and capabilities of the previous generation. So if we're able to have this conversation and to talk about the statistics and the challenges and the trends, because there were people before us that have, paved the way, for us. So I always tend to believe that they have done the best that they could do with the knowledge they had at their disposal in the time that they were operating in. Right? In hindsight, you can always say that people could have done better, but everything is always a matter of context. So in my view, there are things that they did that now, with the benefit of hindsight, we could probably try and do differently. Firstly, and we discussed this, you and I, earlier, we need to work more with each other. We need to work more as a block. We should not be trying to compete against each other. We should try to compete with the rest of the world as a regional bloc. That's something that I think is really important. I think something else that's important is that, we have a culture in general that's very much strong on age. The elder is right and the younger is not. And the younger needs to wait, for his time before he can have the wisdom to, express himself or herself. That's a very, deep-rooted tradition of our continent, and also happens in Asia, and, maybe parts of Latin America. But in this new environment where technology is leading the way to growth and development, the knowledge on technology, on innovations, on the usage of those, transformational trends sits with the young people, right? So now what you sort of need to do is we need to be able to accept the fact that there are knowledges that the young people have, but that doesn't mean that you need to discard the experience and the maturity of the elders to guide us and to support us as we transform our nations. We need to have more intergenerational partnership, in our societies to move forward. Young people should always be respectful of elders, and elders should be respectful of the innovation and the energy that young people can bring to the table.
Brilliant. Well, as we come to a close, my final question to you then is, as the Mandela Rhodes Foundation, we're obviously very privileged to work with the next generation of young leaders from across the continent, currently in 38 African countries. What might you want to leave some of our young leaders with when you think about actually the 3 top values that have really held you, especially when it's been tough? Because I think sometimes these young people, they see us, Mark and Judy are in Davos, high life, etc., etc. But we know you're also having some tough chats in those rooms and you're having to find your voice. What are those 3 core values for you that you feel you've really been able to draw on to be able to feel like you're standing in your integrity as a leader?
Voice your opinion, express yourself, but always in a way that's respectful. I think that sometimes we young people, because I still consider myself young, as we believe that we have so much energy that's just, so we express ourselves and we're sometimes aggressive because we are just, frustrated. We want things to happen better. And then it's not well received because the way you express yourself sometimes is more important than what you actually say. So express yourself, voice your concerns, participate, but in a way that's very respectful. I think that's the first value that I really want to emphasize: respect and engagement. The second one is to focus on the long term. When you're a young person in an environment, in a job environment that's very challenging, we are more likely to want to make short-term decisions because we want an income, because we want to progress quickly, and sometimes we make short-term decisions that compromise long-term, benefits. So, I would want to sort of, engage and say, try to always think long-term, even if that can, hurt you in the short term. Think about what people will say, or how will you feel 5-10 years from now if somebody were to find out what you did today. I think that's really important. And then the last thing and the third thing is build relationships. We live in a world where technology has disintermediated us. We are all on our phones. We, forget to connect with people. And at the end of the day, development, policies, business, it's really about sitting with somebody and trying to understand what's important to them and letting them know what's important to us and finding a way to find mutually beneficial arrangements. But that comes from being curious, that comes from getting to know them, that comes from respecting the way they feel, their boundaries, and to make sure that you put, really people at the heart of the way we engage with each other. So I guess those would be the three things I would like to leave the next gen, with, among many other things.
Beautiful. Mark-Alexandre, thank you for reminding us that leadership in this moment is as much about intention as it is about innovation. It's also as much about responsibility and considering the pace of things. Merci beaucoup, monsieur, for joining us today on the Mandela Rhodes Foundation podcast. Fantastic. And to our listeners, if this conversation sparked new thinking for you, please do share with someone who will be interested in shaping systems, building ideas, and navigating leadership in uncertain times. Join us once again soon as we continue to explore what ethical, values-based leadership looks like, especially in a rapidly changing world.